people talk about war, we consider its cost. Are you sure you decide for yourself whom to hate? That your rage is your choice? Enmity, hatred, the sense of an enemy don't appear suddenly. They are created, first quietly, almost imperceptibly, and then they become part of your life. You think it's natural, that it's just an emotion, but in reality it's a product, the result of work, a deliberate technology, and it works even when you're confident you can think independently. If you remove emotions and look coldly, for example, at the Russo-Ukrainian war, it becomes obvious it didn't start in 2022, and not even in 2014. It started much earlier, in words, intonations, formulations that were repeated for years from television screens and news pages. Back in the early 2000s, Ukraine in the Russian media space gradually ceased to be a brotherly country. First, cautious doubts were expressed. Are they going the right way? Aren't they being deceived? Then the first hints of hostility appeared. And in 2008, Vladimir Putin, at a meeting with George Bush, said a phrase that then barely made the headlines: Ukraine is not even a state. This wasn't a shout. This was said calmly. And it's precisely such phrases that work best. They don't argue. They set a framework. After Maidan, the process accelerated. Evening talk shows on federal channels began to look the same. The same faces, the same intonations, the same words. Dmitry Kiselyov on Vesti Nedeli spoke of anti-Russia. In studios, words like Nazis, junta, fascism were heard. Artyom Sheinin on the program Time Will Tell literally shouted that talking to such people is useless, and this sounded every day. It's important to understand, propaganda's goal is not to convince you immediately. The goal is for you to get used to it. When the same thing is repeated for years, the brain stops perceiving it as aggression. It becomes background. You may not agree, but you already live inside this worldview. American historian Timothy Snyder wrote, "Propaganda is dangerous not because it makes people believe lies, but because it deprives them of the ability to see complexity." This is exactly what happened. Ukraine ceased to be a complex country with different people, opinions, and destinies. It turned into one word, them. And here begins the first key step of the technology of hatred: generalization, when instead of a specific person, an abstract mass appears. They're like that. They always. They never. At this moment, the face disappears, the name disappears, the story disappears, and along with them, empathy disappears. Think about how news sounds. They shelled, they threaten, they want. Behind these words, there are never specific people. But war is always about specific people, about those who are afraid, about those who lose, about those who die. But the language of war is designed so you don't see this. The next step is simplification. The world is divided into black and white. Ours, good, others, bad. Any attempt to say that everything is more complex causes irritation. Any question is perceived as weakness or betrayal. In 2022, this became especially noticeable. Any doubt was declared working for the enemy. Complexity became dangerous. But simplification alone is not enough. Emotion is needed, and that emotion becomes fear. Fear of an external threat. Fear of losing the country, the familiar world, the future. In the news, words like threat, encirclement, attack constantly sound. Fear is built up methodically day after day, but fear is a bad emotion for life. It exhausts, so it's transformed into rage. Rage gives a sense of power. It's easier to live with. With it, it seems you're not a victim, but a fighter. And here a turning point occurs. A person begins not just to fear, but to justify aggression. War begins to seem not a tragedy, but a necessity. Next, the most dangerous stage, moral permission. When words like, "They don't deserve pity," "They're to blame themselves," "You can treat them like this," are heard on air, the internal prohibition is lifted. A person stops feeling guilty about hatred. They stop doubting. They consider their rage correct. Philosopher Hannah Arendt called this the banality of evil. The most terrible things are committed not by fanatics, but by ordinary people who have stopped thinking. The technology of hatred doesn't make a person a monster, it makes them indifferent. And indifference is the ideal soil for war. Then repetition kicks in. The same formulations, the same slogans, the same images, day after day, for years. This creates the feeling that another reality simply doesn't exist, and the illusion of choice appears. It seems to a person that they understood everything themselves, drew conclusions themselves, chose a side themselves, although their route was laid out in advance and not by them. Investigations by independent journalists showed how identical theses simultaneously appeared in different programs, how experts spoke in the same words, how narratives were passed down from above and replicated without changes. This is not chaos. This is a system, and it's precisely this that allowed the situation to be brought to the point where war seemed inevitable. And here we come to the main thing, to the cost of war. Because the cost is not only destroyed cities and killed people, the cost is destroyed connections. Families where relatives don't talk to each other, friends who became enemies, and millions of people who stopped seeing each other as human. The most terrible thing about this technology is that most people are sure this doesn't work on me. But hatred rarely looks like hatred. Most often it looks like care, protection, and supposedly common sense. And when you stop noticing this, war is already inside you. The cost of war is the moment when a person becomes an enemy even before a shot is fired. And if this moment is not seen, not realized, and not stopped, what comes next becomes much more terrifying. There's a moment that's almost always missed when talking about propaganda. For some reason, everyone looks for crude lies in it, fakes, primitive deception. But if everything were that simple, this technology would have broken down long ago. The problem is different. Real propaganda almost never starts with a lie. It starts with truth, but presented from the right angle. Remember how it sounded. They don't listen to us. They don't respect us. We were humiliated in the 90s. This isn't fiction. These are real feelings of millions of people. Real experience, real pain. And that's precisely how it worked. Because first they don't lie to a person, they sympathize. Then into this sympathetic framework, something else is very carefully mixed in. Not hatred immediately. First explanation, who's to blame, why it turned out this way, and here the figure of the enemy appears. It's important to understand, the enemy is not a person and not a country. The enemy is an explanation, convenient, simple, emotionally charged. It removes responsibility from you and simultaneously gives a sense of power. You're no longer a small person in a complex world. You're part of a struggle, history, confrontation. In Russian media space, this turn was especially noticeable after 2014. Crimea became not just territory, it became a myth about restored justice. And it was precisely at this moment that Ukraine first began to disappear as living people and appear as an image, as a function, as anti-us. Look at old broadcasts, 2014, 2016. There were almost no words Ukrainians there. They said Kyiv junta, nationalists, radicals. This is not accidental. This is a classic technique of dehumanization. You stop seeing people, you see a label, and with a label, you can do anything. Then more. From 2018 to 2019, the theme of existential threat appeared more and more often on air. Ukraine was no longer just mistaken. It supposedly has no right to exist in this form. Phrases like, Ukraine as a state doesn't exist, or it's an artificial formation were heard live. This wasn't said by marginals. This was said by deputies, hosts, experts. And here a key turning point occurs. If a country doesn't exist, if a people is erroneous, if history is fake, then war ceases to be war. It becomes restoration of order, and therefore morally permissible. Important. All this was presented not as aggression, but as defense. We are forced. We were left no choice. If not us, then they'll get us. This is one of the most ancient and effective mechanisms. A person is not offered to be evil. They're offered to be necessarily harsh. And here the next level kicks in. Emotional conditioning. Talk shows, political programs, endless debates. They didn't so much inform as form a reaction. Who shouts is right. Who doubts is weak. Who asks questions is suspicious. Notice how often the word traitor was heard on air. Not as a legal term, but as an emotional cudgel. It instantly shuts down conversation. Because after it, arguments are no longer needed. You're either one of us or enemy. And here propaganda goes beyond the screen. It begins to live in everyday life, in kitchen conversations, in comments, in families. People start repeating intonations without noticing, repeating formulas, repeating hatred, but now from themselves. And at this moment, the most dangerous illusion appears. I think this myself. A person is sincerely sure that these are their conclusions, their logic, their position, although in reality they've simply internalized an emotional construct prepared for them. Psychologists call this the effect of captured thinking, when logic no longer seeks truth but serves an already formed feeling. And the smarter the person, the better they do this, the more elegantly they justify hatred. But war requires more. It's not enough for you to agree. It needs you to get used to it. Get used to death, to destruction, to words like shelling, losses, killed. At first it shocks, then frightens, then exhausts, and then becomes background. And here the cost of war begins to grow exponentially because at some point you stop reacting, not because you're cruel, but because your brain is tired. It's protecting itself. It's dulling feelings. But the dulling of empathy is not a neutral process. It changes a person. When someone else's pain no longer evokes a response, space is freed up inside. And this space is very quickly occupied by irritation, cynicism, sometimes contempt. This is where phrases come from. What did you expect? They're all like that there. There are no wars without victims. These words sound calm, even mundane, and that's their horror, because they mean war is already inside. And here it's important to ask a question that almost no one asks. How much does such a war cost? Not in money, not in destroyed cities, but in people, on the other side of the screen, in who they become. After all, the cost of war is not only the dead, it's also millions of people who have unlearned to doubt, who are afraid to ask an extra question, who confuse loyalty with humanity, who consider rage a form of strength. And this is precisely why this technology is so stable. It doesn't require constant lies. It requires habit. The habit of not feeling, not checking, not stopping. And if it seems that this is somewhere far away, that it concerns others, it's worth stopping and asking yourself, when was the last time you caught yourself thinking that someone else's death no longer evokes anything? No pain, no fear, no question why. If that moment has already happened, it means war has taken more than it seems, and it will only get harder because the next step is not hatred. The next step is justification, and after it, consent. And there the cost becomes truly unbearable. There's a moment that's rarely spoken about aloud. War doesn't start with the first shot and doesn't end with the last. It starts earlier, in the head, and ends later, in the same place. This is precisely why its cost almost always turns out to be higher than we're ready to admit. When hatred becomes habitual, it stops being felt as hatred. It disguises itself as realism, common sense, experience. A person no longer shouts. They reason. They speak calmly, confidently, sometimes even tiredly. And in this calmness, the main marker that war has gone too far. Look at how language changes. At the beginning of war, people say killed, then when died, then losses, then just numbers. Each next word is further from a living person, and each next word is cheaper. This is how devaluation works. This is how psychic defense works. But any defense has a reverse side. When death turns into statistics, life also begins to lose weight. Someone else's life first, then gradually your own. This doesn't happen instantly. This is a slow, almost imperceptible process. This is precisely why it's so dangerous. At some point, a person catches themselves thinking, well, yes, it's terrible, but... And then rationalization follows. But war is war. But they're to blame themselves. But it's always been this way. These buts are like patches on cracks in reality. They allow living on without asking too heavy questions. The problem is that questions don't disappear anywhere. They're simply postponed, and then they return. At night, in silence, in a feeling of emptiness, in irritation, in insomnia, in a feeling that something broke, but it's unclear what exactly. The cost of war is also people who outwardly adapted but internally lost support, lost the sense of where the boundary of the permissible lies, where justification ends and complicity begins, where you can still say, I disagree. The most terrible moment comes when a person stops asking questions, not because they received answers, but because they understood. Questions are dangerous, not necessarily for life, sometimes for comfort, status, relationships, the illusion of stability, and then self-censorship kicks in, quiet, internal, almost imperceptible. You no longer argue, not because you agree, but because, why bother? You no longer check information, not because you trust, but because everything's clear anyway. You no longer want to delve into it, not because you're indifferent, but because you're tired. And here war truly wins, not on the battlefield, but in consciousness. Because a person who's tired of thinking is the ideal environment for any manipulation. It's important to say one unpleasant thing. No nation is immune to this. Not the educated, not the critically thinking, not the historically traumatized. The history of the 20th century proved this too many times. Germany, Rwanda, Yugoslavia, everywhere the mechanism was different in form but identical in essence. First the image of the enemy, then moral permission, then habituation, then silent consent. The Russo-Ukrainian war in this sense is not an exception. It's tragic precisely because it shows even closeness of language, culture, history is not protection. Sometimes the opposite, it makes the blow stronger, because betrayal always hurts more than enmity with a stranger. And here arises a question that rarely sounds publicly because it's uncomfortable. Is it even possible to oppose this technology with anything? Or is a person doomed to be its part? The answer is unpleasant but honest. You can't completely protect yourself, but you can resist. And resistance begins not with slogans and not with heroic gestures. It begins with small things that seem insignificant, with a pause, when you want to immediately be outraged and you stop for a second, with a question, when you're offered a simple explanation and you ask, who benefits from this? With memory, when behind the word losses, you see people again. This doesn't make you better than others, and this doesn't guarantee correct answers, but it preserves the main thing, the ability to remain human in a situation where this is not expected of you. The cost of war is precisely here, in the choice to think or to repeat, to feel or to dull, to notice or to turn away. These are not loud decisions. They're not visible from the outside, but it's precisely they that determine what trace war will leave behind. Our channel exists not to give ready conclusions or impose a position. We don't shout, because there's already too much shouting. We count the cost, calmly, coldly, honestly. The cost of war is always more than it seems, and if we stop counting it, it means someone has already decided that paying can be infinite, with others' lives, others' fates, others' humanity. And we talk about this not because it's easy, but because silence costs more. They shout about war. We count its cost. And if after this video you're left not with a feeling of anger, but a feeling of anxiety, it means it worked. Because anxiety is the first step toward awareness, and awareness is the only thing that's not so easy to turn into a weapon. Think about this, and don't stop asking questions.